For decades, people have asked the same question. If the Exodus really happened, where is the evidence? Where are the records? Where are the camps? Where is the trail through the wilderness? Where is Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the sea? Some people say the answer is simple. There is no evidence, because the story never happened. Others say archaeologists have already found the proof, but the world refuses to look at it. The truth is more careful and more interesting. Archaeology has not given us a museum label that says, Moses stood here. It has not produced a signed Egyptian report saying, we lost our slaves at the sea. Ancient empires did not usually record their humiliations that way. But archaeology has uncovered a world that looks much closer to the Exodus story than many people realize. Here is the missing context. The strongest evidence is not one sensational object. It is a pattern. Semitic people living in Egypt, forced labor, Egyptian place names that match the biblical route, memories of slaves escaping through border forts, a wilderness tradition rooted in real geography, and a Bible story that knows Egypt from the inside. The Exodus begins with a family entering Egypt because of famine. Joseph rises to power, and Israel settles in the land of Goshen, Genesis 46:28-34, Genesis 47:1-6. Generations later, Exodus says that the descendants of Israel multiplied until a new king feared them, oppressed them, and forced them into labor. Exodus 1:7-14. That is where the first piece of context matters. In the eastern Nile Delta, archaeologists excavated Tel el-Daba, the site identified with ancient Avaris. This was not a tiny village. It became a major settlement with strong Near Eastern or Asiatic connections. The people there had burial customs, houses, and cultural markers that were not simply Egyptian. They came from the world of Canaan and Syria-Palestine. Does that prove these people were the Israelites? Not by itself. But it does prove something important. The Bible's opening world is historically plausible. Semitic-speaking peoples did live in the Eastern Delta. They did settle there. They did grow. They did interact with Egyptian power. The Exodus story is not floating in fantasy land. It is rooted in the very kind of world archaeology has uncovered. Some popular documentaries connect Avaris to Joseph directly. They point to an elite tomb, a statue with unusual features, and a multicolored garment motif. That connection is debated. We should not pretend the tomb says Joseph. It does not. But the deeper point still stands. Genesis places Joseph's family in Egypt's eastern delta, and archaeology shows a major Asiatic population there during the right broad cultural world, Genesis 47:11-12. Then the story darkens. Exodus says Israel's growth became a threat. Pharaoh turned a family into a workforce. He made their lives bitter with hard service, mortar, brick, and field labor, Exodus 1:11-14. Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom speak about forced labor, state-building projects, and foreign workers. Ancient Egypt was capable of exactly the kind of labor system Exodus describes. Again, this does not name Moses, but it makes the world of the story concrete. The second kind of evidence is geographical. Exodus is full of place names: Ramesses, Sukkoth, Etham, Migdol, Pi-hahiroth, Baal-zephon, Exodus 12:37, Exodus 13:20, Exodus 14:1-2. Some of those names are difficult. Some locations are debated. But this is not the language of a vague legend. It reads like a memory attached to roads, border zones, water crossings, and wilderness stations. One Egyptian papyrus, often discussed by scholars, speaks of runaway slaves moving near frontier places, such as Sukkoth and Migdol. That does not prove the Exodus, but it shows that the biblical root language fits a real world of Egyptian border control and fugitive movement. This matters because many people imagine the Exodus as millions of people vanishing into empty sand. But ancient escape routes would have moved through guarded frontiers, military roads, lakes, marshes, and controlled crossing points. If the biblical Israelites escaped, they would have been moving through a world Egypt knew how to police. Then comes the sea. The Bible says the Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind, the waters were divided, Israel passed through, and the Egyptian chariots were thrown into confusion. Exodus 14:21-31. This is where viral claims often take over. You may have heard that divers found chariot wheels at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. You may have seen images of circular coral formations said to be wheels from Pharaoh's army. Here is the honest version. Those claims are not accepted as verified archaeological evidence. Coral can grow into strange shapes. The objects have not been published in a way that would satisfy normal archaeological standards. We should not build faith on an image the evidence cannot carry. But that does not mean the sea crossing has no historical texture. The Hebrew phrase, often translated Red Sea, can also be connected with the Sea of Reeds, and scholars debate the exact location. Some propose marshy lakes in Egypt's eastern frontier. Others argue for deeper water traditions. The Bible itself presents the event as a miracle, not as a trick of geography. But even the geography matters. The eastern delta and Sinai approaches include water barriers, wetlands, wind effects, and military routes that make the story's setting more concrete than a simple cartoon map. The strongest claim is not "we found Pharaoh's wheel." The stronger claim is this: the Exodus story remembers the kind of borderland where escaping slaves, Egyptian chariots, water barriers, and wilderness routes all belong. The third piece is the wilderness. After the sea, Israel travels into the wilderness. They come to bitter water, hunger, thirst, and eventually Sinai. Exodus 15:22-27, Exodus 16:1-3, Exodus 17:1-7, Exodus 19:1-6. Some videos claim the real Mount Sinai is Jabal al-Lawz or Jabal Makla in northwest Saudi Arabia. They point to a blackened peak, a split rock, and ancient markings. Others strongly reject this identification and argue that the evidence is too thin or misread. The location of Mount Sinai remains debated, so how should we tell the story? Carefully. We can show the theory. We can show why it fascinates people. But we should not present it as settled fact. The point of the wilderness scenes is not to turn every rock into a headline. The point is to see that the biblical story moves through a real ancient landscape, desert routes, water scarcity, mountain encounters, and a people learning dependence outside the empire that enslaved them. And here is the surprising thing. The Exodus is not only remembered in Exodus. The rest of the Bible treats it as the defining act of Israel's identity. The Ten Commandments begin with this memory. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Exodus 22. The prophets return to it. The Psalms sing it. The New Testament uses Exodus language to speak about deliverance, baptism, Passover, and redemption. Psalm 78, Hosea 11:1, 1 Corinthians 5:7. That does not settle every archaeological debate, but it tells us how central the event was to biblical memory. So did archaeology finally prove the Exodus happened? If by prove we mean one artifact that forces every skeptic to surrender, no. But if by evidence we mean a growing pattern that places the biblical story inside the real world of ancient Egypt, Semitic settlement, forced labor, frontier routes, and wilderness memory, then the answer is far more interesting than most people have been told. The Exodus was never just a travel story. It was the moment God confronted an empire, heard the cry of slaves, judged the gods of Egypt, and formed a people in the wilderness. Exodus 2:23-25, Exodus 12:12, Exodus 19:4-6. Archaeology can uncover cities, tombs, roads, bones, inscriptions, and broken pottery. But the Bible asks a deeper question. What kind of God enters history for the oppressed? That is why the Exodus still matters. Not because every stone has been labeled, not because every debate is finished, but because the story stands at the center of Scripture's vision of redemption. Israel was not saved because they were powerful. They were saved because God remembered his covenant. And the ancient question still waits in the dust. If God can bring slaves out of Egypt, what empire is too strong for him now?